It's my great privilege to introduce the participants for our next discussion on what really drives and defines success. Our first speaker, Amy Chua, is a professor of law at Yale Law School and is probably best known by most of you as the author of the 2011 bestseller, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. She's a 1984 graduate of the college and a 1987 graduate of the law school, where she was the first Asian American executive editor and officer of the Law Review. She's a multiple recipient of Yale Law School's Best Teaching Award and is heavily involved in mentoring and affinity groups like APALSA and Outlaws. Her most recent book is The Triple Package: How Three Unlikely Traits Explain the Rise and Fall of Cultural Groups, which she co-wrote with her husband, Jed Rubenfeld. And she just returned from Dublin, where she gave a talk to 600 women entrepreneurs on the triple package and women. Our second speaker is Vivian Louie. He's currently the program officer at the William T. Grant Foundation, which invests in research to ensure that young people from diverse backgrounds reach their full potential. She was previously a visiting professor at Hunter College and has written 2 books. The first, Compelled to Excel: Immigration, Education, and Opportunity Among Chinese Americans, and the second, entitled Keeping the Immigrant Bargain: The Costs and Rewards of Success in America. Vivian is a 1988 graduate of the college, received her PhD and MA from the Yale Department of Sociology, and an MA from the Stanford Department of Communications. Finally, our esteemed moderator, Jeff Yang, a good friend of mine, is Senior Vice President for leading consumer insight consultancy, the Futures Corporation. He's also a columnist for the Wall Street Journal Online, and is one of the country's leading commentators on Asian American issues. He's a frequent contributor to PRI's Takeaway and WNYC's The Brian Lehrer Show, and has authored several best-selling books, including I Am Jackie Chan, My Life in Action. He's also the editor of 2 graphic novel anthologies, Secret Identities and Shattered. Jeff is a 1989 graduate of the college, and he has a son, Hudson, who will be starring in an upcoming sitcom on ABC called Fresh Off the Boat. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff to start the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Nelson. And thank all of you guys for coming out on a lovely Sunday here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Back in Science Center D, which for some of you guys may, as certainly it does for me, fill you with feelings of anxiety and dread. But not today, because today we're going to be engaged in, I think, one of the most apropos conversations that this terrific summit, and it has been a terrific summit, hasn't it? You guys been having a great time, right? Yeah. Maybe a little too great a time. Last night was, let's just say that triple package-wise, impulse control was not happening. But the reason why this conversation is so incredibly apropos, again, for the ending of this summit, is that this entire summit, to more than a little extent, has been a conversation about success, about not just success, but the price of it, and the price of not having, about failing, the value of failure, the value of resilience after failure, and we as Harvard students, especially as Asian American Harvard students, have been engaged in a lot of ways in that narrative our entire lives. If you, all of you guys who are graduates of the college, which means most of you, I see some young people who are learning, and graduate schools, yes, know that certainly for undergraduates, the way our careers begin is essentially with this feeling that we've attained a pinnacle of success. You know, this is the thing that our parents have been dressing us in crimson diapers for since, and yet immediately upon arrival, we are told to look left and to look right, and informed that out of the three individuals seated in those chairs, not all of us, essentially, will walk out of these hallowed halls with the same feeling of success, of being at the pinnacle of the world. So today we have perhaps 2 of the most articulate and high-profile and, I think, engaged individuals when it comes to the larger global conversation around what it means to be a parent, and in many ways to be a child in today's modern economy and evolving society. Amy has essentially, launched several at this point global conversations of her own around the notion of what goal-oriented parenting looks like in a modern age. And meanwhile, Vivian, from an academic perspective, has really driven a lot of the conversation of what it means, especially to be an immigrant and to be immigrant parents shaping their children's success. So I think we have essentially all the tools here for a terrific hour of conversation, and we're going to make sure that we give plenty of time for you guys to ask questions as well, because we know you have plenty. But in beginning our talk today, we thought that perhaps the first thing we need to do is essentially define some of the terms we're using. And we talk about success. Again, success comes in many forms, many varieties, but when we use it academically or in a popular conversation, the interpretation of success can often be very different. And I'd like to turn first to Amy. Obviously, you've been at the very center of warring definitions of success since the very beginning of the release of Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. How do you define success, and especially as a mother, not just as an author?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back, and thank you all for coming. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. In terms of definition, working definition for success, that part's not that hard for me. I think of success as achieving your goals, whatever they happen to be. Whether, like many of my students, being a public interest lawyer, community organizer, or a novelist, or a brain surgeon, or hedge fund owner. Now, here's the problem, going back to something you said, I too was traumatized in this room, okay? And for most of, I think for 33 years of my life, I didn't know what my own goals were. That is, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So it's kind of hard to be trying to succeed at something. So, and I think I'm probably older than most people in this room, but my parents didn't want me to come here. They were immigrants. I was the oldest of 4 daughters, and my dad said, he taught at Berkeley, said, you will live at home, you will stay at Berkeley. I had to forge his signature on this application to get in. But when I came here, I maybe like a lot of you in the audience, I feel like my students are different now. I feel it's generational. But I was just stereotypical. That is, my parents wanted me to major in a science. They wanted me to be pre-med, so I blindly started off, and I thought I was so great, applied math and Gov, I think. And it was catastrophic. I had gone to a public high school and didn't know what I was doing. I remember, I think Mansfield is still here, Harvey Mansfield, and I took this class, and I remember he was lecturing, talking all about the Peloponnesian War, and everybody was nodding and writing stuff down. I had never heard of this thing. And I was thinking, what era is this? This is like after Vietnam or something? And so I quickly, practically failed out of those two. I quickly switched majors to economics, but not because I was excited about it, but I thought it was the closest thing I could do to persuade my father that it was sort of like a science. I dropped out. I went to law school. Now, this is so different. My students at law school now, not all, but many of them want to be there. I think there's a shift in Asian Americans. But when I went to law school up the road, there were almost no Asians. It was rebellious for me to do that. And the problem is that I went to law school by default. Okay, so I'm going back to success again. I was there, and I was totally lost. I was totally lost. The first thing is, I was raised in a household where I wasn't taught to challenge authority and to think for my, I was a great student, but we didn't, my husband's Jewish, and at his dinner tables, the parents would debate politics and philosophy and Middle Eastern, we just like ate really fast. And do our homework, So when a professor would say, what do you think of this Supreme Court opinion? Miss Chua, I had no thoughts. I was like, what, a judge wrote it? I think it's good. And I also started to have a psychological problem because I felt like, wait, am I not that we would have, somebody murdered somebody, 5 people, and yet evidence was taken from his house illegally, and everybody was up in arms about this. How can the police do this? And I was like, but I don't care about that guy. Why should he just, and I started thinking, so to answer your question, I will say that when I look at my students, the ones that I think are successful, hitting it out of the park, I think it's the ones that are doing really well at something that they love. That would be my definition, and it basically took me like 35 years to find it.
And you have found it, fortunately. But one of the I think, real pushbacks in some ways around the notion of kind of the driven parenting that is associated not just with your first book, oh, not first book, but I guess it would have been your third book, was it? But the first one that kind of commanded global attention in that way, is that it is about, in a lot of ways, impressing goals upon a child. And immigrant parents, obviously, and I think a lot of us are probably nodding in recognition here, are often very guilty of that, of projecting a particular set of expectations and objectives on their children. And Vivian, I mean, you've obviously studied this in depth. When you talk about success, and when you look at how immigrant families define success, you've explored kind of the paradigm around success and failure in kind of a different context in some ways than how Amy has framed it here. How is your definition of success similar to what Amy's shared, or different?
Sure. So why don't I just, one thing that Harvard trains you to do is to take the conversation where you want it to go. So I'm going to do that. So you can bring me back to where you want me to go. But I'm going to go where I want to go. So where I'm going to go.
Rebellious cubs.
I say, my mother would not be happy. But, so I wanted just to say, I want to make 3 key points. And we can do whatever we want with those 3 key points. Sure. And one is, just because there are ethnic differences and ethnic patterns in success, and we know that to be true. We definitely know that in the United States because that's how we measure, right? That's how we measure things like educational attainment, home ownership, income. But just because there are those differences doesn't mean that ethnic cultures drive those differences, right? And I think that's a key thing that we need to keep in mind. I do applaud the work that you've done and the work that you and Jen have done, especially with the triple package. It was so great rereading it for today. So excited to be here. But I also wanted to say that when you have a story about ethnic culture, it's an incomplete story, right? It's an old story. It's a compelling story. It's a story Americans love to tell about America since the beginnings of our history here and moving forward until today. So what completes the story? What do I think needs to be a key part of the story? And it's the role of institutions. And it's the power of institutions to actually offer opportunities and constraints to people, right? To achieve success, to not achieve success, and what they can do within those contexts. So what I wanted us to push in thinking about, it's the power of history, the power of policies, right? And I can certainly talk more about that. But then the important thing to be thinking about is that so much of the conversation when we talk about groups in America, and I'm a sociologist by training, so of course I study human societies. I must do honor to my discipline. We study group interactions. That's what we're all about. But when you study groups totally in the perspective, or too much in the perspective, of what they bring to the table, of their pluck, of their perseverance, of their enthusiasm, of their motivation, of their optimism, and certainly I talk about all of those things in the research that I've done. But that's not enough, right? That's not the entire story, because that's not going to be enough to get them to the door. Success is a two-way street, and that's something that I think we need to be mindful of. So.
Yeah.
You can push wherever you want.
No. We're headed in the direction I want to go anyway. Thanks for Leo. And in fact, actually, it is a really good segue, because when we talk about success and the definition of it, there are really multiple levels, multiple contexts in which you define success. There's individual success, as noted. What we as members of a community, or members of a culture, may be able to achieve, and how we define it for ourselves. But then, yes, there is that question of groups and culture, and the role of, again, the larger communities around us, and the degree to which that shapes our ability to be successful. Now, of course, the triple package, and for those guys who have not read it, the triple package, essentially, Amy and Jen, her husband, looked at different cultures and trying to essentially assess what factors within those cultures were most likely to essentially encourage the development of individuals who were capable of, who were optimized for success in American society. And there were three factors that they actually hit upon as seemingly across different communities, across different cultures, being common ground, essentially, for success. And again, these are the triple package. In fact, would you mind actually refreshing us a little on the terms behind the triple package?
So I guess the first thing I want to do is I want to stress, I want to tell you what the subtitle of the triple package is. It's how 3 unlikely traits explain the rise and fall of cultural groups in America. So I would probably reframe a little bit of the way they put it, because I actually agree that it's not, I do not think that there's any success is not built into any groups or cultures. Just the opposite, actually. I think one of the most interesting phenomenon is that of third-generation decline. So this just shows that it's not, stuck in any group's ethnic thing. When you come to America, almost all immigrant groups follow a very predictable arc. And this is where Battle of the Tiger Mother meets triple package, but the children of immigrants, I guess you call them second generation, that would be me, tend to be successful according to conventional measures. That is high educational attainment, professionalism, but by third generation, that is the grandchildren of immigrants, that they tend to fall, again, by conventional measures. So the statistic that I find most interesting is, so everybody, you probably know that Asian American SAT scores on average are about 140 points above the rest of the country, the national average. But I think the more interesting statistic is that if you break that out, third generation Asian Americans don't do better than anyone else. So that shows it's not genetic, it's not hardwired into a group's culture, it's much more related to Vivian's work, which we cite all over the book. It's really sort of like an immigrant phenomenon, right? And it's not, the media made it like these 8 groups, but it's actually tons of groups, like 30 groups that are all far performing above the national average, and they tend to be immigrant groups. So just quickly, the triple package, we say the key ingredient actually is insecurity. And this taps into, and because if you just feel, so the idea is that when we looked at all the groups and actually also individuals that are disproportionately succeeding, they all have this feeling that they're not quite good enough yet, that they have something to prove. And I think that's what all the other accounts of success don't account for, which is drive. Right, so everybody's talking about, and Vivian's totally right, institutions, but also parental wealth is the big one. How much is self-selection? How about, isn't it just like if you have rich parents, that's why you're successful. Well, of course that's incredibly important, how wealthy your parents are. You donate the science center, you don't need any motivation. But here's what parental wealth doesn't explain. It doesn't explain third generation decline. Right? Because if it's all about how wealthy your parents are, then by the time you get to the third generation, they should be even more successful, because by then they're more comfortable. And so the 3 ingredients of the triple package are insecurity, which often comes from being an outsider or instilled by your parents. That's another thing. But if you just had insecurity, you could be crippled and depressed. So that has to be combined with what we call a superiority complex, which is a sense of exceptionality, that you're destined for great things, that you can be the best. And the third is impulse control, basically, which I more define as the ability to resist the temptation to give up. So, shading into Angela Duckworth's kind of grit measures.
Exactly. Well, so obviously, especially with the notion of third generation decline, the very sense that immigration and the path of immigrants, right? Not just the cultural, not just the actual capital, the wealth or socioeconomic class of immigrants, but the cultural capital and even the journey of immigration may play some sort of role in how we look at these groups' success. That's something that has come up in our conversation prior to this session itself. Do you feel, Vivian, that in looking at immigrants, the very fact that people have had the drive to come here You know, to actually bring their kids here, to make this massive journey across waters, across continents, itself may actually, again, screen for a certain set of traits that aren't necessarily cultural in inherent value. That this is just about, in some ways, the fact that immigrants have guts.
Sure, that's a great question, Jeff. Happy to answer it. But before I do, I just... Now I'm just going to be polite and my good girl training, which is I realized I didn't thank the organizers of this wonderful summit, and thank all of you for coming. It's just really a historic event. I was here at the last one, and this is just it's gratifying, and to be here on this stage with the both of you, and to thank Amy for researchers. We put our work out there, and there it is, right? And oftentimes other researchers in the public marketplace of ideas, they kind of rip off your ideas without having actually read your book or your articles. And I know from reading the triple package that you and Jen actually did, which is so gratifying. And so anyway, so the thank yous are done. All right, so then getting back to the question about immigrants. Yeah, so of course, immigrants are self-selected, right? I mean, it doesn't matter in what context you're talking about historically, from what nation to what nation. I mean, to make a journey in which you leave everything you've known, everything, your culture, your language, your friends, your family, and to make that journey and start all over again, that's a big thing. It's a huge sacrifice that you're making. That said, we know from what's happened in the United States over time, and I'll just talk right now particularly about Asian Americans, it's not enough. It's not enough to be an immigrant and to have that motivation, that selectivity bias, if you will, right? There have to be particular circumstances that allow that drive or optimism to come to fruition. Again, it's the two-way street of success. So the whole idea about Asian Americans being successful is really a post-1960s phenomenon. And there's no accident with that. It was because before the 1960s, Asian Americans were not welcome here. They were welcome for their labor and how they and other immigrant groups really built America into the powerhouse that it was, and that we hope that it can continue to be, but that's an open question. So, but the fact of the matter is that from 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act until 1943, Asian Americans were excluded of all different groups coming to America on all different kinds of criteria. They weren't allowed to become naturalized citizens. They weren't allowed to own land. They weren't allowed to testify in court. They weren't allowed to be in certain professions. They went to inferior schools. Hey, you can have all the drive, optimism, and motivation you want, but when that happens, what do? I mean, in the Chinese case, right, you go into the restaurant business, of which my family came from, the garment industry, of which my family also came from, or you go into the laundries. That's also part of my family history. Not because you want to do that kind of work, that's hard work. If you've ever been into those places, you don't want to be doing that kind of work. So what happens is that you need things to shift, right, to actually move to the other side, so that you can have that two-way street of success. And what happened in the United States was the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement, of course, ended segregation in the United States by race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, and other lines of difference. But it did more than that. It also informed the Immigration Act of 1965, right? Civil rights leaders pushed for that, the reopening of large-scale immigration to the United States, to end almost 4 decades of basically a closed-door policy based on your national origins. So when we talk about the immigrants who are coming post-1965, and I'm sure many of us who are in this room are part of that flow, you have to understand where that came from, and also the America that immigrants have entered into post-1965. Most of us in this room would not be here at Harvard, in an institution, by the way, that had a long history of closing its doors to American Jews.
Especially, yes. I think that one of the most fascinating contexts around success, especially in relation to Asian Americans, is this larger conversation around how external cultural institutions, how the media especially, wants to essentially position a narrative on top of us as Asian Americans. And it is something obviously that all of us have seen and lived in our own lives, but certainly read and you know, watched reflected on screens and you know, kind of written out in headlines. This narrative of Asian American exceptional success, the whiz kid syndrome, the model minority, and it is so easy for us to actually buy into that narrative, for us to be sitting here collectively, you know, as this group of people who have succeeded. I mean, certainly succeeded more than, maybe not as much as our parents would have hoped, because they're never satisfied, but more than most of America could have asked for. And think that it's somehow because of who we are, because of where we come from, because of even what our parents have done for us. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, you mentioned civil rights, and I think, you know, perhaps the single biggest force for schism right now within Asian America is the conversation around whether or not there is meritocracy, in a lot of ways, in access to things like higher education. There are Asian Americans who feel that, you know, that affirmative action, for instance, is something that is anathema, because it's excluding Asians who have succeeded according to the letter of what is asked for by institutions of higher learning, who are being left out because of a perception that other groups who have achieved less, who have, on that sort of very hard, cold, numerical basis, not gotten that 120 points over the SAT average of the American norm. Those places are, as a result, being unfairly granted to those individuals. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, if success is defined by just pure numbers, how much you earn, how many points you score on a test, you know, the degree to which you are employed versus not employed, then yes, Asian Americans may have you know, hit those numerical goals. But is that in spite of, do other groups face different kinds of pressures? Are we looking at a situation in which our perceived meritocracy is, to a certain extent, you know, blinded by some of the things that, you know, we fortunately have come into context with because of the sacrifices of prior generations of other communities?
Yeah, well, there's so much there, Jeff. I'll take a stab at it, then turn it over to, you know, to Vivian, and we can continue. Just like 50 questions in there. Well, the first thing I want to say is I do want to go back, and I totally agree with Vivian about institutions. We say, like on the third page of the triple package, that you can have all the sense of exceptionality and insecurity and drive that you want, but if the institutions don't allow you to rise or put a glass ceiling on you, you're not going to rise, right? I mean, so the Jews and the shtetls, they were probably pretty motivated. They're not going to rise. Japanese internment. And this is obviously true in our inner cities today. So that's clearly, we have these problems of discrimination. Now, I don't know how to come at this, Jeff. I want to, it's really difficult for me as a Yale law professor because I mentor several affinity groups, and you see the clash. So tonight we're actually, you know, just had 70 APALSA students, but I also am very involved with the Black Student Association. And when you hear, you know, one side's complaint sounds like whining for another side. I mean, it's very, you know, you should hear the conversations about what you're complaining that you're stereotyped as hardworking. So it's very complicated. But I guess I want to come at it a little bit differently and maybe let Vivian go to the heart of this. To me, in case it's not obvious, we chose the terms for the triple package very deliberately. Deliberately choosing quite negative terms, right? Obviously, we could have written a book that was much less controversial by saying, you know what it takes to be successful? Confidence, grit, and big dreams, right? Nobody would. But instead, we chose superiority complex, insecurity, clearly a negative thing. And I think that's because we wanted to have an honest conversation about what the costs, like why are people motivated? What makes people who are not going to starve feel like they have to keep working and working, and is that good? And I think one of the things that I like most about the triple package thesis that does it, I think it's a process of creative destruction where each generation offers something. So the immigrants come over, my own parents, they're clearly the hardest working, most grit, save the most, but one pathology, one negative thing is that they are narrow, right? They are narrow in how they define success. Partly it's not their fault, partly because they need to survive, right? They're afraid their children can't make it. So they don't want their children to be a jazz musician or a poet. It's like, come on, you need something that you can make money, get a house. They want classic respect. They want a car, things they can show off, you know. And it makes them less civic. It makes them less public interest oriented because they're only worried about their children and their family. So the next generation, you're a little freer. You lose some of the superiority complex because you're less identified with the old country. Many of us, you know, can't even speak the language well, and also you're imbued with America's greatest value, equality. So you see your parents like, oh, China's the greatest country, whatever, Korea, whatever, as bigoted, right? You want to interact, and then, and I think the third generation is the trickiest because we could say it's decline, or I think that is often among my students. I think the third generation is the one that is most free to do things that are community oriented, that are not necessarily just not clear markers of success. You know, so I don't know how that adds to, you know, to answers your question, but I think when you think about grades and these markers, we actually treat the need to succeed conventionally as a kind of pathology of triple package cultures. It's true of Mormons, for example, too, and Persian Americans, right? You want to prove yourself to your parents, you want to prove yourself to your community, you want to show the world who is looking down on you. So you try to get these things that are very obvious. So anyway, that's kind of a partial response.
Sure, no, that's great. Okay, so thank you. That's this is a big question. So let me take it on. So basically, the one thing I do want to put out there is, of course, Asian Americans are a very diverse population. According to the U.S. Census, it's as many as 25 different groups. So not everyone is successful, even if you're talking about income, educational attainment, home ownership, right? And so, for example, Southeast Asians are not doing as well. Now, on the one hand, you can kind of understand why, right? They're fleeing for their lives, the trauma of exit from that region post-Vietnam War. I mean, that's a big thing. And so I do want to give a shout out to someone who couldn't be here today and at this conference, but Dr. Pitsmai, she's actually, I was her doctoral advisor. I taught at the education school here for some years. And she herself is a Lao refugee, and she is the first Lao American doctorate in education from Harvard, and the first and to date only Lao American tenure track faculty member in the country. So, no, she's successful, but I think, I just had dinner with her last night, but I think she would be the first to say, from a personal level, but a professional level, her research, she specializes in educational leadership with an emphasis on technology. She's at University of Massachusetts Lowell, not too far from here. And so, but she'd be the first to say that there are many other factors besides grit or optimism, right, that people need. Now, even for a refugee group, like the one to which she belongs, which of course is political refugees, you come with certain supports from the US government. But what happens when those supports end, right? We need to do a better job of understanding what those experiences are like. The second thing that I want to point out is we often don't talk about the fact that Asian Americans can also be undocumented.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we should put it out there. I mean, there's been undocumented immigration, certainly from mainland China. Since 1993, the grounding of the Golden Venture off New York City, but there's undocumented immigration from all different kinds of Asian national origins groups. The third thing that I want to say is, and this relates to the whole issue of the glass ceiling, right? So, as a researcher, I look at the research, and what the research really has tended to focus on when it comes to Asian Americans is that high school to college transition. It's almost as if after we finish with college, we don't exist anymore in the data points. I don't know about you guys, but it's been a long time since college for me. I mean, I had a great time in college, but there's more to life than getting into, right, a Harvard or a Yale or Princeton. It's what happens to your life afterwards. So what happens to your life in the labor market? What happens to your life in civic engagement? And I know Margaret Chin, I can't see her right now, who's a sociologist by training as well, class of 1984. And I'm a great supporter of the Summit and other wonderful causes. But I know Margaret is writing a forthcoming book, and I don't know if the title has changed, but it's tentatively titled Working the Real World, is that right? Well, that's one of the titles that I've seen. Basically about second-generation Asian Americans who have been professionals, so they've gone on to college, they've fulfilled, right, the bargain of immigration, but what happens to them in the workplace? I mean, it's going to be a very important piece of work because it's going to be one of the few pieces of work that show us that. And that's important because what do you do with all the education? Right? I mean, in a world that is truly supposed to be about meritocracy, we're supposed to be up there in the top ranks. But in the academy, I think it's less than 1% of university and college presidents are Asian American. I mean, you know, Margaret can tell you, I'm not going to put her on the spot, but if you want to, you can talk to her later, but about all the other statistics in different segments of the labor market. Why is that the case? What's going on? Those are key questions that we should be asking ourselves.
I think that, especially bringing the conversation into the notion of the workplace, and you mentioned the glass ceiling.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things which has been really interesting within the media recently has been the conversation around technology and you know, Silicon Valley and the representation of different racial groups in Silicon Valley. And the first wave of data coming out, self-disclosed data from the top companies in Silicon Valley, showed that Asian Americans were wildly, disproportionately represented, right? You know, something like a quarter to a third of tech workers in these companies were Asian American, whereas only a fractional percent were African American or Hispanic. And people pointed to that as a sign that Asian Americans had arrived, that, you know, we may have built the railroads, but now we're building the information superhighway, blah, 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 right? And that's when the second wave of data started coming out, showing that despite the fact that Asian Americans were overrepresented as employees, they were underrepresented at the top ranks as executives, as leaders, as members of boards, and that proportionally, in terms of pay, because of that, while they were engineers and coders and programmers, they were not making equivalent salary relative to their peers, despite the fact that they were represented in numbers. So let's talk about that. I mean, again, that whole notion of success and how it's defined. On some level, do the things that we say, you know, kind of drive success, provide for us the tools to compete in a workplace where we no longer have parents necessarily looking over shoulders, no longer have a community driving us along and, you know, that we're competing with in the same ways. What happens when we're out of college and in the workforce and facing the realities, as Margaret is writing about, of being an Asian American and in that larger, wilder world?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know how many of you have actually read Battle Hymn, but this is, to answer your question, I think where Battle Hymn, the Tiger Mother, and the Triple Package come in is, most people don't quite realize this, but both books actually celebrate rebellion. And I think this is part of the answer to the, you know, so if you read Battle Hymn, the Tiger Mother, if you read just the first few pages, it's like, oh, you have to play piano, violin, you know, play dates. But if you think about it, you know, but if you read to the end, you realize that the heroine of the book is my younger daughter, Lulu, who is actually in the audience right now. She's a freshman year. And then at the end of the book, when my daughter is rebelling and I decide to back away from this, you know, the success of this Tiger Mom stuff, I disclosed that my own father was a rebel, that he was a black sheep in his family. He hated his family. He left Asia, eloped with my mom here, and never looked back. And another thing is, my mom, when she loved the book, but she said, you know, no Chinese person would ever have written this. Because it's a very, in your, you know, what is it, the loudest duck gets shot, you know. And so that's like, if you read, you know, that's how I saw that book. And then in the triple package, we're explicit about it, and I think this is how I advise my students, not from an empirical scientific point of view, but just personal anecdotes to my students. How do you break out? My own view. So the triple package, we say that the ideal thing is if you can climb the triple package, like use some of the resources that, in a way I see the triple package as how to turn being an outsider into a source of strength. That's what I see it as, So the sense of superiority, that is like an armor in a country that basically discriminates, that has excluded, So just one little story, when I was in 4th grade, there was a kid named Jeremy Hall who kept running around making slanty eyes and kicking me. Because he liked you. I was enormously fat. He didn't like me. So I went home and I told my mom, I complained, this guy's making slanty eyes things, making fun of me. And my mother was furious at me. Okay, not him. She said, "Why are you worried about this stupid guy?" She said, "We come from the oldest, greatest, most magnificent civilization." It's like a non sequitur, right? Like, why would you worry about the, And okay, and I think that's a very catching story because you can see the intolerance, how this kind of this ethnocentrism, the we're special, shades into intolerance, and can bigotry, we're better than other people. But as like an 8-year-old girl, that sense of ethnic pride and identity gave me a kind of armor against societal discrimination. So that's how but what we say in the book is actually the best is if you can harness that drive and motivation, but then kick away the ladder and basically rebel, right? So Lee, we've had a couple of interactions, he had a very similar thing to me. I'm sure you heard this, after he got the Academy Award for Brokeback Mountain, his father said, "That's great, now, but you're still young, now maybe you can become an academic." So just anecdotally, what I tell my students is you need to crash through, you need to crash through stuff. A lot of that involves throwing off the pressures that your parents put on you. I'm racing back after this to host a dinner at Yale. It's our alumni weekend for Godwin Liu, who is a justice on the California Supreme Court, Taiwanese, son of Taiwanese immigrants, totally raised by tiger parents. But I was telling him that my mom, this goes to the question about, do we want to parent this way? I mean, I adore my mom, but she is the person who always makes me feel bad. So she said to me a very similar thing. She said, when are you going to stop doing these outrageous things and do something respectable, like be a judge? But to me, it's like clear, it's like loving her and respecting her, but kind of just tearing myself away from some of those feelings that has allowed me in some ways to approach breaking through some of these ceilings.
Vivian, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I think, that definitely breaking through is important for sure, and I would totally be down with that. But I think that in addition to breaking through, we need to see actually what's on the other side. And we need institutional supports and networks of support. You can't break through if you don't even see the door, right? Where's the door? And so it's getting to the other side, and part of that is having data. Asian Americans need to be more represented in data sets that social scientists can then use to understand what's going on. If you're not in the data, we're not going to know things. I think that's very important, and we are, nationally speaking, a small group but growing, but we're not in nationally representative data sets. And that's huge because economists use those for data analysis, sociologists use those, right? Lots of other academics use those data sets. If you're not there, then it's just not going to happen. So I think that's definitely one point. The other point I wanted to bring up is that, you had mentioned earlier, what does success mean? And I think to me, success also means that you be civically engaged. And this gets back to your point, right? That, we are all in this room, we've had a certain amount of privilege, right? To be alumni of Harvard. And when I say that, I do not mean to suggest that you didn't earn it, you didn't work hard for it, and you're not working hard. Of course you did, we all did. But it's also supposed to give you, right, that license to think broader, deeper, right? To be rebellious. I totally agree with that. And also to think about where we want the United States as a nation to be going, right? And what does success mean? And how do we get to a place where more people can become successful? Just in some basic parameters, right? I'm not asking for much. Educational attainment or, you know, feeling safe in your neighborhood. Okay, but let's talk about education. So a recent report that was released by the US Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, shows, this is data based on the nation's 97,000 public K-12 schools, which incidentally educate most Americans. All right, about 90–95% of Americans go to public K-12 schools. And what the data showed was that the public high schools where most Black and Latino students go to school, nearly a quarter of them don't have any Algebra 2 courses. Fully a third don't have any chemistry courses. You think about the pattern of when you got to college, so got to graduate school. What was the significance of taking Algebra 2 chemistry? If your school doesn't even have a chemistry course, you might not even know that chemistry exists, right? I would say that that's not a great thing that we should be, having in the United States, especially as we're thinking about where we can go as a nation and the success of the nation. It also showed that Blacks are nearly 4 times as likely as whites. We weren't even in the data, okay, so just saying. But Blacks are nearly 4 times as likely as whites, and Latinos are twice as likely as whites to be going to public schools where about 20% of the teachers do not meet the state standards. Now, we've all had great teachers, right? I can say that. I don't need to have a show of hands for that. Teachers are hugely important. I'm just putting it out there for you to think about.
Jeff, can I jump in with this since we're talking about education? Because I totally agree with Vivian, but to be a little provocative on the other side.
Sure.
Well, first of all, I just totally agree with 100% with that. This is just I think the most important study that we cite in our book, which again nobody talks about, is what I call the reverse marshmallow test. So I'm sure you guys have all heard about the actual marshmallow test. Was in the 1970s at Stanford, Walter Mischel took a bunch of kids and said, do you want to have 1 marshmallow now or wait, I can't remember, 15 minutes and you'll get 2 marshmallows. And it turns out that tracking those kids, 30 years later, all the kids that waited the 15 minutes, that showed deferred gratification, were wildly more successful in actually all, surprisingly, not like happiness, stability of family, income, education. But the more interesting studies, they just ran this same test at Rochester a couple years ago, but with one twist. So this time, they took half the kids and they lied to them first. Okay? They said, if you do X, Y, and Z, we will give you these cool, art supplies. So these kids, they did X, Y, and Z, and then they didn't deliver the art supplies. Okay? And then they ran the marshmallow test. Do you want 1 marshmallow now, or do you want to wait 15 minutes and get 2 marshmallows? All the kids who had been lied to grabbed the first marshmallow. Right? And that's a really important story because that shows that it has nothing to do with impulse control or the ability to defer gratification. If you don't trust your institutions, right? If you think they lie to you, if you believe that your hard work will not be rewarded, you're going to grab the first marshmallow. Why? So I totally agree with Vivian in that sense. Now, one of the great things that's happened with the triple package, I seem to, just controversy everywhere. I was saying, somebody was asking me, what am I going to do next? I said, if I write a cookbook, I would be slammed. But one of the great things on the education front is actually behind, we had this immediate outpouring of support from educators around the country. This is public high school entities, nonprofits, the nation's 2 largest inner city charter networks reached out and said, we're maybe using different names, but the triple package is exactly what we're trying to instill. This sent high expectations. By the way, high expectations combines both a sense of superiority and present inadequacy. Right, because it's not just you're amazing, you're perfect, you could stop now. It's you have amazing potential, we know you can be fantastic, but you're not quite there yet. So it combines those 2 things. But the neat thing is these inner city, we just did this program at Yale with the public law thing. it's a sense of exceptionality based not on a group affiliation or ethnicity or religion, but rather the kind of pride and exceptionality you can feel in having overcome the odds, right? In having beat the odds, a kind of individually earned sense of exceptionality. And anyway, to end, I agree with Vivian that, look, we need to do something to fix our institutions. It's not a level playing field. Some people face ridiculously hard uphill battles. But I will tell this story. I got this email from a guy right in the middle of all the controversy. He was a Mexican-American public school teacher in Southern California. And he said, I'm baffled. I'm Mexican-American, I'm also a dad, I teach high school, I read the triple package, I love it, and I cannot understand all this controversy. He said, I teach, and I have principally Asian and Hispanic kids, and I know you've actually researched these two groups, but he said, I think about culture and achievement every day of my life. I look at my Latino kids, and they have one set of attitudes and behaviors. I look at the Asian kids, they have different, and those behaviors lead to higher grades and achievement. And he said, so I told my son, we're going to do everything they do. And he said, my son just got admitted to, it's Ivy League school, whatever. So it was very interesting. So that's the other piece of it, that I think this fear of talking, of course we have to fix our structural discrimination and institutions, but it is also degrading for some minorities, the idea that you have no agency, that all you could do is wait for discrimination to be eliminated, right? Or somebody else to fix that. Like, a lot of people want to know, what can we do as a teacher, as a parent, as a family, to do this? What kinds of attitudes? And Justice Sonia Sotomayor is from not a triple baggage family, struggling Puerto Rican family, father an alcoholic. She's a friend of mine. She's just at Yale. And she, in her biography, said, her autobiography, which is amazing, supports this. She said that when she was in 5th grade, she was a terrible student. I mean, she had nobody to teach her, right? But she did have a sense of exceptionality from her grandmother, but no ability to be disciplined. And she went on her own initiative to the best student in her class and said, how are you a good student? What do you do? And the girl started talking. She goes, no, I want to know everything. When you leave here, what do you do? Tell me. And she said, I taught myself to be a good student. So I think we can't make it taboo. That certain, in a way, it's a little bit of a luxury for us to be debating the meaning of success. I've noticed a class bias. When I go talk to people who are lower middle class, they don't have this, like, how do you define success? It's very clear. I want my children to rise. I want high education. I want to make more money. So we can't get too fancy, I think, because not everybody has this, has the privilege.
Can I just say something very quickly to that? I think those are really great points, Amy. And you did reference, so my first book, Compelled to Excel, looked at the transition to college amongst the children of Chinese immigrants, so second generation Chinese. And then I also had a more recent book, the second book, Keeping the Immigrant Bargain, the costs and rewards of success in America, in which I wanted to look at how the transition to college actually happened among second generation Latinos, Dominicans and Colombians, who really have come to the United States in larger numbers post-1965. Now, I chose that comparison because so much of the language and the narratives in the United States post-1965 is the Asian American overachiever, the whiz kids, and the Latino underachiever. They're all immigrants, so what's going on, right? What's up? So I said, okay, fine, so let's take a look at that. So I also compared the data that I collected with the Latinos to the earlier data that I collected with the Chinese Americans. And what I found was that actually there were similar mechanisms of success. Okay? So working class poor Chinese and Latinos, right? What are those mechanisms of success? Your parents, your immigrant parents, they have to pass on that message. Work hard, do well in school, education, right? You have to agree with your parents. And then also your parents in some cases are able to actually find out some good information about good public schools, K through 12, get you going on that journey. But in both cases, that was insufficient. That was not enough. The pivot was actually the networks of support, people who believed in you, adults, right? That you were exceptional, but whatever, that you can do something, right? That you can move, that you can be successful. Believe in you and we'll show you the way. We'll show you those steps, right? That's huge, because if you don't know that, then you're not going to move.
And that actually circles back to Jim Kim's incredible speech at the top of this conference, where he said that we can't just be, we have to do, right? The idea that there is a need for compulsion, for a belief that you can act on that potential is so critical to success. I just want to, before turning it over to questions from the audience, I know there are eager hands waiting to spring up. Just on the marshmallow test, I did in fact actually communicate with my kids the marshmallow test and how important it was to delay gratification, explain to them the whole 1 marshmallow versus 2 marshmallow thing, and my kids were sitting there thinking about it, and then Hudson said, "But Dad, you don't let us eat marshmallows." So maybe there are other factors involved there too. With that, let's go ahead and get some questions in here. I think we have volunteers. When you ask your question, please make sure it is a question. I know there's a, so we'll take as many as we can. I think we've got at least 15 minutes here. And let's start over here. And then Mitchell. All right, over here.
Thomas, sir, class of 78, law 81. And this may be a provocative question. You're talking about success, and I'm interested in your ideas about success for a group. I don't feel like I suffered much, if any, in terms of discrimination in my generation. And I'm wondering, when I hear things like appropriate representation in different activities or segments of society, why is it necessarily the case that we must be represented as if we were demographically representative of our, in the general population? I mean, I get that I guess it hurts me in some sense that, I don't know, the university presidents don't reflect a general percentage perhaps, but I'm not sure that I care whether some other activities, I mean, if it were overrepresented in music or math or STEM or something like that, that's nice. There are winners and there are losers. Do I need to be represented, or are you just sort of, is there a value judgment being made about certain desirable activities in society and we're not across the board in all of them? So what is your thought about success for an ethnic identity in general society as opposed to wherever they tend to fall out, once you take care of institutional barriers?
I like that question a lot, because I always warn my own students not to get into self-loathing, because it's like, so the idea is, oh, we're stereotyped at being good at math and whatever. I was terrible at math, and nobody has to be good at math, but if you are good at math, you should stand proud, right? The whole world wants to be good at math. So, but I think the usual answer to your question is it's positions of leadership that we're worried about. Positions of visibility where you actually can control the agenda and the national conversation. And in my own, not as empirically rigorous as yours, but I see South Asians, not Southeast, but Indian Americans and Pakistani Americans as being much more represented in spheres like being judges and prosecutors and DAs, and I see this at the law school, and it ties back to interesting cultural issues, not in an essentialist way, but I think it's interesting why we talk a lot about, with Godwin Liu, why so few East Asians in these things. Part of it could be language. So anyway, that was my immediate response, and it has something to do with being able to transform society, these positions that can actually, leadership positions, when we talk about the corporate glass ceilings.
Well, so I wanted just to build on those points because I think they're important in the sense of course you want diversity in leadership positions. You also want diversity because it's a public good, right? I mean, you want to, and diversity is good for everyone to be in the same room and to actually be from diverse backgrounds. We know that from the existing research. And that's something that is good. I mean, it's part of our national identity, and it's good for us on an individual level.
I think that, and I'm only going to answer this because it's something that especially the whole, well, if you're good at math, be proud of being good at math thing, has impacted my own life. If you're one of those Asians who doesn't happen to be good at math, and there's no role model out there for somebody who is not good at math, who is nevertheless successful doing something else, it can be kind of depressing to not have, that arc of success outlined for you in examples in the real world. So diversity also represents a way to achieve different kinds of goals, different kinds of objectives that you might not have considered or even imagined if those examples weren't out there.
Just a quick thing, I have a student who's a Chinese American at the law school, and she's from Berkeley, where the entire, I mean, it's like, I don't know what the numbers are, like huge numbers of Asian Americans, and she said to me, I never had an Asian American professor. And so that made, well, I mean, she was in a philosophy or something, but she just said,
All right.
Hi, I'm Mitchell Dong, Harvard class of 75. The H4A did a survey of our membership. 2,000 people, 400 people responded, and we asked them about their experiences with tiger parenting. I wanted to just quick, we found that there were more tiger dads, by the way, than there were tiger moms. But we asked what their experience was, and we got a lot of really interesting comments, particularly from women, saying that they lacked self-confidence, they suffered from lack of self-esteem, and one woman commented that she went through 25 years of therapy to get over it. So my question is tiger parenting worth it? I mean, you get into a good school, you make a lot of money, but you're unhappy for the rest of your life.
I saw the survey, and it was so interesting, because that's actually very consistent with the triple package, again, why we chose these terms. Now, the survey tool is interesting, right? Because I've seen so many what's the definition of a tiger parent? And I've seen some definitions where I would be answering, absolutely not, I'm not a tiger parent either, which is, mean and uncaring, don't listen to your child, grades no matter what. I tend to think of tiger parenting as projecting high expectations with unconditional love. But being able to listen. So I think it's a choice that everybody makes, has to make for themselves. I agree with those. I'm not surprised when I saw those statistics, and this is what I mean by it all ties together, right? It ties into what we're calling the generational decline too, and also multiple definitions of success. The idea, one of our drivers in triple package success is this feeling that you're not good enough yet, right? That's what makes it. You need to prove yourself. You need to it's not enough. And that can be a terrible feeling, right? And it can be a modestly terrible feeling, just a little bit terrible, or it could be like Vera Wang. She's like, everybody thinks she's so successful. She designs wedding dresses for celebrities. Incredible tiger parents. And what she says is, no matter what she does, she can never feel that she's done something well. She can only think about what she didn't do well, and she doesn't have the confidence. So, and I think that's a great example, because you might say, oh, obviously you don't want that. I don't want to raise my child feeling that way. On the other hand, as one of my students pointed out, but she's Vera Wang. She gets to go to great parties. Yeah, so, but that's the kind of question I don't know. And to me, it made a lot of sense that a lot of people who are raised with tiger parents wouldn't want to do that to their own children. I mean, that makes complete sense to me. Oh, can I just say the one thing though? The flip side of this feeling of that you are not good enough, you need to prove yourself, is being entitled. Okay, because being entitled is precisely feeling, I don't need to prove myself. I deserve it. I deserve to be CEO. I deserve to be at Harvard. I deserve to have A's. And there are a lot of studies, not in your field, showing that raising children who are just entitled actually has all kinds of bad consequences too. They have very high, not just about success, but very high rates of depression and unable to get along, have empathic relationships with other people. So you always have to see what you're comparing the tiger parenting to, right? I mean, Asian Americans have very low rates of substance abuse, right? And that tends, maybe says that could be an accidental benefit of strict parenting, right? It's just hard to compare all these. I think it's hard to compare. You have to know what's on the other side.
Hi, I'm Lauren Dye, class of 2013 Cabot House, and I've met a lot of really inspiring people at this conference so far, and I've noticed that a lot of the very successful people who we've had on panels are all kind of, the way I describe them as like, have bootstrapped their own success, like amazing professors or like entrepreneurs. What's the difference between kind of Asians succeeding in those kinds of fields versus succeeding in a field like being CEO of like a Fortune 500 company? And why are we maybe less successful at the latter?
I think it's probably Vivian.
So I should say from the get-go that I don't focus on the labor market and workplace in that way. But I understand what you're saying, and it's a good question. I mean, so I'd have to say that there might be different kind of norms. Okay, so right, let's take corporate law. Why don't we take corporate law, right? You probably know about that, but I'll just share what I think I know. So corporate law, it's a network-based field, and the degree to which you're successful depends on being a big rainmaker, right? Bringing in big clients into the firm. But that depends on your networks, and it depends on who you know, and who you know also depends on how comfortable people feel with you, and having you be in charge of their account. Right? And so that leads to kind of questions that are harder to pinpoint along the lines of, what were the fields that you mentioned, the academy, and what was the other?
Like, for example, entrepreneurs or venture capitalists.
Okay, right, like Silicon Valley. So, but Silicon Valley, so that's something, if you acquire the capital and you have the chutzpah, then you can move forward, and it's something that you create for yourself, right, in collaboration with other people. But it's not something in which, are people willing to take a chance on you to make some brain in a larger corporate marketplace where you have other people, right, vying also for those kinds of dollars. I mean, that's kind of how I would answer it.
Since I teach corporate law, I agree with Vivian, but here's what I tell my own students. Two-part answer. First of all, I don't know if you guys know Tim Wu. He teaches at Columbia, just ran. He has a great line where he says, again, this is on the more cultural side. He says that, let's just use the term, white people, they have this kind of quarterback mentality, which is like when you're in a corporate firm, you don't just do everything. It's like you have this attitude, like I don't. And I often tell my Asian students, I was like, don't just like hole up and keep working, because that's not the way to suggest that you can be a leader. He's talking about how you have this kind of quarterback mentality and attitude, like hold yourself up a little bit, a little pride. The second point I want to make is I'm always an optimist, but if you look at the immigration numbers and also I think, again, not empirically tested, but I think that you're going to see a huge change, even at the corporate leadership in your generation. I see my students, my Asian students, and they are not like me anymore, right? They are not lost people who came to law school by default. Many of them are very, very community oriented, don't want to make any money, but others are leaders. Like a student tonight, Rich Tao was president of the student. I mean, just they're big leadership roles now. So I think that's going to change, but we'll see.
I think actually something that Vivian said and that you kind of alluded to, Amy, is really critical. This notion of there being a pre-existing network of individuals who can accept and invest in you and believe that you can succeed and provide the connections and the relationships. And one of the things which is really interesting about the journey that my son is on is that while everybody's always asking, oh, so what have you done to encourage him to succeed, blah, blah, okay, nothing. Just let him be, try to be as supportive as possible and nurturing as possible and, tell him he can succeed. But the biggest differentiator right now, for the reason why the show's even on the air, is something that nobody here is aware of yet, and that I do intend to write about, which is that at ABC, at the top ranks of ABC, right below the president, everybody who is in a decision-making capacity turns out to be an Asian American woman, right? The head of comedy, Sami Falvi, right? Sami, I think her maiden name may be Lee, she's a Korean American woman. The head of casting, Kelly Lee, another Korean American. Maybe they're all Korean American women. And the head of global sales for ABC, who is basically the primary veto power as to whether any series gets to air, because nothing goes to air unless they think they can sell ads around it, is a Chinese American woman. So for the first time in history, in primetime history, a network actually has at the very top tier of gatekeeper privilege, let's say that, individuals who not only care about their community, want to see it succeed, are not afraid to step up and say, we think it's time for this to happen, but are in a position to do something about it. So, let's
I think we got time for one last
more question.
And,
Hi, Kunja Kim, College 01, Law School 04. This is a question about parenting and success. So success is truly achieving your own personal goals. At what age do you think a child can be fully his or her own agent in deciding his or her own goals? And so, I guess the question is, at what point should a parent step away from the parent's view of supporting the child, stepping away from the parent agenda, and fully supporting the child in realizing his or her own goals?
I think we're all going to, I suspect we're going to have different views here. So the lesson that I learned, and the reason I wrote Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, is I definitely think that starting around adolescence. So my own view now, and having kind of lived through it, is I am somebody that is still a big fan of, I don't know what you want to call it, traditional parenting, more self-discipline when children are very young. I think the ability to focus and concentrate and stick with something is ever more important with all this technological distraction. We're always texting, But I think starting, I don't know, maybe 11, 12, mistakes I made, you need to start letting go, phasing, and I don't think it's all or nothing, but it's kind of a phase out. To me, the opposite of a tiger, people misunderstand this. I think a tiger parent is the opposite of a helicopter parent, right? Because a helicopter parent is somebody that's like, you want to make things easy, you do stuff for the kid, you can't write the essay, let me do it, hover, prepare, protect. I think the tiger parent actually, it's like, in a way, you put more obstacles when the kid is little. You take the hardest classes, double up, I had to do this, and so to me, when it works well, again, going back to Mitchell's question, because we all define it differently, when it works well, I think that tiger parenting actually leads to more self-reliance and independence. I mean, that's the way I like to think about it. And so certainly, I think I held on too long. My age 12, 13, she just didn't want to do the violin anymore, didn't want to, it's clearly not working, But I will say that people are shocked that at college, I see all these other people much, much more invested in their children. I mean, doing much more. I didn't care what they majored in, they are on their own, they're just, I know about the parties they're at, I'm okay with it. It's the time, they're true to my bargain. It's like, I did what I can up to a certain point, and now, hopefully you're gonna make it on your own.
Do you want anything to that? Okay. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm so glad we've had not just great communication and discussion here, but also great questions from the audience. So hopefully all of you guys had a great time. Do not leave yet, however, because as much as the stories being told here have been fabulous, and the narratives that we've been exploring here have been great, we actually do have another event afterwards in this very room that I'm hoping you guys stay for, which is the Voices Storytelling Competition. And if you want to talk about different modes of success, different places where we can achieve our goals in, being able to tell our own stories and raise our voices is really critical. So before anybody leaves, let's have a fantastic round of applause for me and Vivian.